It was the evening of September 4th, 1878, and two sisters, Jane and Esther Cox, did their nightly preparations and went to bed. They shared a modest room on the second floor of their family home at 6 Princess Street in Amherst. Jane fell asleep quickly, but Esther, still suffering the pain of a recent heartache, tossed and turned in her bed. A strange scratching noise snapped her out of her state of self-pity. Jane, wake up, whispered her sister. Listen. The cardboard box that they used for storing scraps of fabric and spools of thread was bouncing up and down as if a mouse was stuck inside the sewing kit. Jane yanked the lid off the box. There was nothing unusual inside, just spools of thread and a few scraps of fabric. Rushing into the room, Daniel Teed, their brother-in-law, thought that this was a sign they were going to hell.
Esther Cox was a young woman of about the age of 18 who was living here on Princess Street in Amherst with her older sister, her sister's husband, and her siblings. And Esther, about that time in 1878, started to have some very strange paranormal experiences while in the home there with her sister.
The next night, September 5th, a few minutes after she had gone to bed, Jane was awakened by the sound of Esther screaming. Trembling with fear, Esther just kept repeating over and over, "I'm dying, I'm dying." Esther was in a troubled state. The entire household gathered at her bedside once again. "I'm dying!" The young woman seemed to have lost her mind. She kept repeating unintelligible words and shaking her head as if she was possessed. Suddenly, a loud bang like a clap of thunder shook the entire house. Esther crumpled on her bed and fell into a deep sleep, as if nothing had happened.
The family didn't know what was happening, so they called upon doctors, and eventually they called upon ministers and priests to come and help, and no one seemed to be able to help her. She was ill a lot of the time, but it would come and go.
The next morning, the town physician, Dr. Carit, came to examine Esther, who was still in bed running a high fever. He thought she was merely suffering from a slight nervous depression. He was less surprised by his patient's health than he was by the pillow being moved by an invisible hand.
Dr. Carit, who was the family doctor, came over to visit Esther because she'd been swelling up and claiming she was burning up. And so while he was there in the house, blankets were flying off the bed, pillows were flying out from under her head, and the whole family was gathered around.
He came and saw these kinds of experiences and had no answer to them. He went several times and in fact later signed affidavits actually saying what he saw, that he heard strange voices, that he saw things happen in the house. And he could not explain the medical problems that she was having at the time. So there's good documentation of that.
After that, things took a turn for the worse. Marks appeared on the wall just above Esther Cox's head, marks that began to form letters, then eventually shaped into words.
And then all of a sudden they heard this scraping sound on the wall above Esther's bed, and they looked up, and the description that I read said that it was as though someone were using an iron spike to carve into a calcimined wall, and they looked, and the words that were being carved into the wall were, "Esther Cox, you are mine to kill."
It wasn't something that happened while Esther was alone. It happened when there was a number of people in the room, and it scared everyone. It scared the whole town, and eventually the newspapers started writing the accounts of the incidents, and news travels fast in a small town.
Overnight, the house on Princess Street became the subject of curiosity for all of Cumberland County. Rumors were spreading like wildfire in Amherst. What if Esther Cox is possessed?
A number of things started happening around the house. Knives began to fly around the kitchen. Furniture started overturning. And again, all these noises and all these sounds. And they felt like they lived in a haunted house. But when Esther would leave the house, everything would stop. And eventually they discovered that they didn't live in a haunted house, but that it was Esther herself who was a haunted girl.
Wasn't it said that a pastor who had gone to the Cox's house to pray had seen a bucket of water come to boil in the presence of the young woman? Wasn't it true that prayer books had flown out of the pews during a religious service that Esther attended? Esther's health began to deteriorate. For her own well-being, her family decided to send her to Sackville, New Brunswick for 2 weeks to visit a sister who lived there. Nothing strange happened during her convalescence, either in Amherst or Sackville. Things began to look up. Was Esther Cox's illness the devil's work? Hope soon faded. Esther went back to Amherst at the end of the month, and the strange occurrences started up again at 6 Princess Street. Lit matches appeared out of thin air, falling from the ceiling. Fires, which were quickly put out, began to ignite spontaneously throughout the house. No one could sleep anymore. Fearing for his family's lives, Daniel Teed knew that Esther had to leave the house.
He felt it wasn't safe to keep Esther in the house any longer because fires were being started and knives were flying around, and they had 2 small boys. So she went to live with John White and his wife. And at first, John ran a place called White's Saloon, and he would go off to work and Esther would be left alone with Mrs. White. Well, eventually things started, she'd have Esther scrubbing the floor and the scrub brush would disappear and then fall down almost on their heads.
Pursued, Esther returned to her family home on Princess Street. Her arrival was met with a resurgence of bizarre incidents, which were now being reported in all of the newspapers throughout Nova Scotia.
Walter Hubble heard about the story of Esther Cox, I assume through the newspapers. He was a well-known actor from the U.S., and he came up to see for himself what actually was happening. The interesting thing is that Walter was only here in Amherst for a few weeks, but he did arrange to live at the home. He arranged to, as a paying boarder, to stay there. He saw these things happen to Esther, and he slowly convinced Esther and her family to arrange to allow him to take her on the road and show these experiences on the stage to a variety of communities in the area.
Walter Hubble was secretly hoping that Esther's invisible companion would show his nasty side to the spectators.
Sometimes they were disappointed because nothing would happen. Other times they would hear knocking and banging and would be very excited by the idea that Esther had something happening to her on the stage while he did this.
Unfortunately for him, the undertaking proved to be futile. In 1908, he wrote a book on the strange events that happened to Esther Cox called The Great Amherst Mystery.
As a playwright, I'm sure he had a flair for the dramatics, but he made very sure that he factually outlined all the events as they took place and as they were witnessed. And actually, the book, which he entitled The Great Amherst Mystery, which is where the name, of course, came from, his book has a number of the witnesses in town to give credibility to what the story is.
Things weren't any better for Esther Cox when she got back to Amherst.
The thing that makes this story so interesting, once again, is the fact that it wasn't a house that was haunted, but rather a person. And wherever Esther went, the ghost would follow. When knives started flying around the house, they needed to do something because not only was Esther in jeopardy, but now the whole family was. So they eventually tried to farm her out to other places that she could go stay. And she went to this one house, and she wasn't there very long, and she started working in the barn to earn her keep, and the barn caught on fire. Eventually, Esther was charged with arson. The barn burnt down, and she was jailed.
Esther was actually sentenced to 4 months in jail, but got out, I think, after a month because of good behavior, and I think people felt sorry for her because they believed her story. But while she was in jail, a man from Spring Hill started to visit her. They formed a relationship, and when she got out of jail, she married this gentleman.
Esther Cox married a man, a certain Mr. Adams. Amazingly, the wedding ceremony coincided with the disappearance of the ghost of Amherst, who had made Esther's life a living hell for 2 years.
After that incident, the ghost seemed to stop. And just as unexpectedly as it started with no reason, it stopped in the same way.